Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, August 21st, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about the 2024 presidential election, and specifically about Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a third-party candidate who has been in the race for quite some time now, as his running mate says that they are now weighing two options moving forward to the November election. One option, they believe, they can create a new political party, trying to set the foundation for a future third-party candidacy and building out on the Kennedy brand beyond just this one simple presidential bid. The other option they're looking at is that Donald Trump, very clearly over the past couple of months, we've started to see that polling data has shown that RFK Jr. has actually, in fact, started to hurt Trump more than Biden. While not necessarily the super consistent factor, it has become much more apparent in the era of Kamala Harris, when the numbers in the multi-way race showed that against RFK Jr. and Jill Stein and Cornel West, Donald Trump led Joe Biden by 4.2% on average. When in the head-to-head race against Biden, we saw that Trump only performed by 3.1% over Biden. And so it seemed to have suggested at the time that although it wasn't a massive difference, RFK Jr. was pulling more from Biden. It brought him down to below 40%. But when you see the matchup against Kamala Harris, RFK Jr., if anything, is pulling from Trump. Because what we find here is that in the head-to-head matchup, Trump actually gains a narrow amount and nothing super significant, but it does show that this effect here that did impact by roughly 1 to 1.5% of the national electorate has now moved in the opposite direction. And so this second pathway that the Kennedy campaign, as the running mate has now said publicly, is that they are considering dropping out and endorsing Donald Trump. And so this sort of speaks to a general thing that we've understood about the RFK Jr. candidacy that has not been apparent until recently. I mean, it has been apparent, but not as explicitly. It seems that all bets are off 75 days out, 76 days out from the November election. And so what they are saying now is that, practically speaking, this RFK Jr. candidacy has been, from the beginning, an effort to elect Donald Trump and not anybody else. And while many Democrats caught on to that very early, including the own Kennedy family that more than half a year ago came out in support of Joe Biden, and recently too in the springtime created a video with almost every living member of the Kennedy family relevant in politics endorsing Joe Biden for president. It was a massive rejection of RFK Jr., even from members of his own family, who at initial glance seemed like they were staying out of the fray for the sake of their family member. But the stakes got too high. And so these members of the Kennedy family came out in full-fledged support of Joe Biden, and it showed that the Democratic base really wasn't excited about RFK Jr. in any regard. His anti-vax statements, his conspiracy theory statements, put him more in the realm of someone who's pushed out from the Democratic Party rather than someone who's in this bigger tent. And that's why you've seen the RFK Jr. candidacy move more towards Donald Trump. We remember that during the leaked audio, after when RFK Jr. and Donald Trump were talking about how RFK Jr. and Donald Trump says to RFK Jr., quote, "We have to win this thing." What does that mean, right? I mean, that was all the conversation. Is RFK Jr. colluding? His campaign rejected it, saying, no, we are not. But now it has become explicitly clear, as the running mate is saying actively, that Kamala Harris is more of a threat and that their focus is defeating her rather than winning this election. And so they're considering dropping out of the race. And previously, RFK Jr. was found leaked from documents and leaked to the press that RFK Jr. was eyeing up a position in Donald Trump's cabinet if he drops out and endorses Trump. Because of how clear quid pro quo it was, Donald Trump's campaign initially pushed back. RFK Jr. apparently went to Kamala Harris's campaign and did the same thing. Now, Nicole Shanahan rejects that, says that's not true, that didn't happen. Kamala Harris will never be our president. She's more of a threat, which is why we started to see this early indication that they were now shifting away from their own candidacy rather to one in favor of Donald Trump. And it could not be clearer today, as Donald Trump says he's open to making a cabinet position for RFK Jr. after RFK Jr.'s running mate, Nicole Shanahan, said that they might endorse him. And so now that this quid pro quo has sort of gone public, it seems as if Trump is now leaning into it. Before, the campaign on the private side said no, and I think there's a reason for that, because the Trump campaign really doesn't want much to do with RFK Jr. When RFK Jr. was first in the race, Donald Trump praised it publicly because he said RFK Jr. was crazy, but that it would help his candidacy by pulling away from Biden. That was explicit. He said that on Truth Social multiple times. He said that to the press. The Trump campaign was thrilled that RFK Jr. was in the race, because in the beginning, he ran as a Democrat. He ran against Joe Biden in the Democratic primary, and many Democrats actually recognized his name. Why? Because the last name was Kennedy. We saw surveys out there there that people actually confused him with his father. But the point there being that RFK Jr. benefited a lot from the fact that he was a Kennedy, that he was previously a Democrat, and so many of the voters at initial pulled away from Biden's camp. They wanted somebody younger. They wanted somebody new. But as the Democratic Party sort of locked rank, RFK's approvals went down from being net positive to being down 30 points nationwide. And so now there is no pathway forward for RFK Jr. and Nicole Shanahan. Their numbers have completely depleted compared to where they were against Biden and Trump. RFK Jr. had 9% of the national vote. Against Kamala Harris has 4.5%. So you're talking about a massive reduction in support. But it's becoming more of a problem now that you're starting to see Kamala Harris do worse in the head-to-head than in this multi-way race. Because it means in the multi-way race, it pulls away from Trump. Now, in the head-to-head, though, it isn't too much different, right? Democrats shouldn't panic if RFK Jr. drops out and endorses Trump, because these are voters who are being pushed to make a decision very similarly to that of the multi-way race. A lot of the times in these polls, you very often see that they are saying, okay, take away Jill Stein, Cornel West, and RFK Jr., because RFK Jr., Cornel West, Jill Stein won't necessarily be on the ballot in every single state. And so they push them to say, now make a decision. Choose between the top two contenders. And Kamala Harris still fares very similarly to where she was against RFK Jr. And so I think this is also an indicator that there is now an increased sense of urgency, right? When it was a Biden-Trump matchup, nobody thought on the RFK Jr. side or even on the Trump side, very obviously, that Joe Biden would win the election. And that actually has sort of become their downfall. All of the decisions that have been made since then have been working under this assumption that we are in for a locked-in, locked-down election for Donald Trump. Whether it's the J.D. Vance pick, whether it's the investments into blue states, whether it's the rallies in New York and New Jersey, it is a level of complacency and sense of security that loses people elections. Something we never really saw exhibited by the Trump campaign in 2016 or 2020. Even when their numbers said they were up, they were still campaigning, right? In Iowa and Ohio. States they won by 9.4 in 2016 in Iowa, 8.1 in 2016 in Ohio, 8.1 in Ohio in 2020, 8.1 in Iowa in 2020. These are states that Trump won by large margins. And yet he continued to hold rallies there. And even when the data said he was down, he was still investing in some states. That type of hustle mindset for Donald Trump was what won him the 2016 election and got him very close in 2020. Now, he's holding a third of the rallies he did in 2016. And in terms of strategic maneuvering, sure, he's in Pennsylvania, but he's also in New Jersey. Sure, he's in Wisconsin, but he's also in New York. Sure, he's in all of these states, but he's countering it with very bad decisions and ones that have very bad implications for Donald Trump, like the J.D. Vance pick. And now that Kamala Harris is far more popular than Joe Biden and the levels of enthusiasm are through the roof, the Democratic Party has unified. There is not some type of, massive movement away from Joe Biden like there was not only after the debate, but also before the debate. That's where RFK Jr. was getting a lot of that Democratic support that was sort of pushing away from Vice President Harris. But now that the Trump campaign and RFK Jr.'s campaign seem to be in cahoots on this, it is clear that both sides are also terrified of where they are nationally. I think they are looking at it and saying, the numbers are collapsing for RFK Jr. They are not doing well nationwide. I mean, we are seeing that their fundraising numbers are completely plummeted. Nicole Shanahan had to spend $10 million of her own money on the race to give it the boost it needed, and they dropped 4 points in the polls. You see RFK Jr. and his campaign team losing staff, shakeups, not able to contain leaks, videos that were recorded of a conversation with Donald Trump by an own in-house videographer leaked to the press. Someone who was just 10 feet away from RFK Jr. kept the tape rolling. Somehow, maybe not the person recording, because I don't want to insinuate that, because we don't know where a lot of these leaks come from. But someone got a hold of the footage and said, I'm going to forward this to the Associated Press. I'm going to forward this to the New York Times. I'm going to forward this to the Washington Post. Someone had to break the story, and of course, it was covered. And it made RFK Jr. and Donald Trump, arguably, look like they were colluding. Now, they really don't care. They've been doing it so painstakingly, obviously, over the past month, but now it becomes something that they just will openly admit to. And it does, in fact, go to show just how far they'll go to beat Kamala Harris, because that has been the mission of RFK Jr.'s candidacy from the very beginning. It has never been about offering a third-party alternative to the American public. It has been about offering and siphoning votes away from the Joe Biden camp that now seems to have backfired tremendously. RFK Jr.'s candidacy has done an immense stain to RFK Jr.'s name. He will never have political office ever again, or at any point in his life, because he didn't. And this Kennedy legacy is something that won't be tarnished by this candidacy, but certainly does take a bit of a hit. And it's something that I'm sure many of his family members aren't exactly thrilled about. Should RFK Jr. and Donald Trump lose this election, it will look like this political maneuvering genuinely backfired tremendously. Where RFK Jr. came into this race supposedly as an opponent to Joe Biden and was supposed to siphon, do enough damage that RFK Jr. was making a name for himself, and I'm sure at periods of time. He genuinely believed he would make the debate stage. He genuinely believed he would be on track to do even better. Even after that first debate, RFK Jr. believed, and his campaign seemed to be full force ahead. But now it's not like that. Now they're realizing that 75, 76 days out, there's a lot of work to do, and they can't do it in that short period of time. They're not going anywhere more than 5% nationally, so now they're weighing their options. And if they can get 2 appointments or 1 appointment to Trump's cabinet, should he win the election, that's worth it to them. Selling out voters who had selected them, completely deceiving the American public, it is a decision that would be one made out of purely selfish reasons, and not one made out of what seemed to have been. And again, we can see through it. Because when we're talking about analyzing these elections, it is clear when there are spoilers. It's like when both parties have run candidates with similar last names in districts to split votes so that way someone else gets a plurality victory. That has happened. It happened recently in 2020. Republicans ran someone with the identical name to a Democratic candidate in a district. The vote split by just under 2 points. They lost the race by just under a point. And so we've seen this happen before. We can call it for what it is. That this candidacy has been an intentional effort from the beginning to elect Donald Trump to the presidency. And now that it is not working, is looking really bad for RFK Jr. and arguably Donald Trump himself. Because now it's something that the Democratic campaign, should RFK Jr. drop out and endorse Donald Trump, is going to point out and say, this is very clearly quid pro quo, right? And there's a reason why RFK Jr.'s voters aren't shifting over immediately to Trump, even when they're asked in a in a two-way race, who are you going to vote for? And I think that's a really big problem with the RFK Jr. candidacy, is that they seem to believe that this RFK Jr. personality support, or the support, is similar to Trump's cult of personality, where the base will follow where Trump goes. The base will not follow where RFK Jr. goes. You might see an initial 1-point bump, but it'll reverse. And even the reason I don't think you'll see a 1-point bump is because of the fact that Trump and Harris against each other are running roughly even than the multi-way race, even if Harris narrowly underperforms it. Narrowly underperforms it. I think what we're going to find is that the base will just seem to not exist. The voters that were turned out by RFK Jr. aren't all of a sudden going to become Trump voters because RFK Jr. told them to. It's the same thing that we saw with Nikki Haley. When she came out and endorsed Donald Trump, you would have thought, based on the fact that 18 to 20% of Republicans in swing states aren't enthusiastic about their nominee, and many of them voted for Nikki Haley, in some cases more than 20% across the state. You would genuinely believe that that base would turn over to Donald Trump because she endorsed him enthusiastically at the RNC. She endorsed him even before the RNC. And yet in both instances, we saw zero impact. Why? Because these voters weren't with Nikki Haley because it was for Nikki Haley. They were with Nikki Haley because she was the anti-Trump. These voters for RFK Jr. have gotten off the MAGA train and don't want to get back on. The Trump train might be full steam ahead and it's not making a stop at their district, at their state, on the national level. They're not getting back on. And so there's this idea that they're following RFK Jr. to no end. No, he is the end. Kamala Harris might not be the alternative, but they might not vote either. And this unenthusiastic electorate that supposedly was going to give Trump this surge that he needs, should RFK Jr. drop out of the race and be promised a cabinet position, and Nicole Shanahan be promised a cabinet position. These are things that I'm sure the Trump team is genuinely weighing. But what we can see very clearly, even right now, and what we've seen in years past, and even in this election cycle with Nikki Haley as a prime example, is endorsements from major party nominees are not always enough to carry people across that finish line and carry that base through the election. Look at Bernie Sanders in 2016. He endorsed Hillary Clinton after dropping out. He held rallies for Hillary Clinton, and yet a huge chunk of Bernie Sanders delegates decided they were not voting for Hillary Clinton in the general election, no matter what. It was never Hillary, and they might have been pro-Bernie Sanders. If their delegates are obviously much more enthusiastic for Bernie, but for a lot of people, we saw this in 2020. The reason why Biden was winning many of these, Bernie Sanders states from 2016 isn't that they have had a massive overturn in terms of, centrist ideology, that Joe Biden better represents their ideology. It might not be necessarily that. It may be that in 2016, a lot of these states were anti-Hillary Clinton. Look at West Virginia, for instance. She lost every single county in West Virginia in the Democratic primary. Why? Because clips ran of her from her opposition that showed her against fracking, showed her against all these things, and for green energy, which is not a popular take in West Virginia. She got demolished in that primary. Years later, Biden wins the primary. And so again, talking about following a candidate, talking about endorsements, it isn't the end-all be-all when it comes down to changing a national election, especially one where people feel so passionately about both sides of the aisle. while this may be something that RFK Jr. and his candidacy, and his campaign team rather, are considering and weighing their options of, it's not something that I see as this masterful move that will all of a sudden save Donald Trump's chances at the presidency. If anything, it's embarrassing, and it goes to show that from the very beginning, RFK Jr.'s candidacy was nothing more than a sham to eventually endorse Donald Trump. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.